Hi guys, today's a super fun one. I'm so pumped for week 15. Man, the weeks have gone by so quickly. Every single week is super exciting for me because I get to share things I love, but this week I love fairy tales. I love plot twists, points of view, all those super fun things about writing a story. It's awesome, or about reading a story. So, first we're gonna go through plot twists and point of view, which I will explain. And then we're gonna talk about differences between fairy tales, fables, folktales, and myths. And all the intricacies, all the complexities, that's a word I can pronounce, involved in all that. Oh man, I'm so pumped. Okay, so first we're gonna talk about point of view. And the point of view in a story is talking about whose eyes are you seeing from? Whose eyes are you writing from? Who's the narrator? So for example, I was walking in the forest when my ribs started to hurt. I sat down, and as soon as I sat on the log, the flowers beside me began to grow up and bloom around me. That would be an example of first person. In first person point of view, the main character is yourself. Sometimes it can actually be yourself if you're telling a story that's happened to you, or you can just pretend it's yourself. Fun fact, when people write stories that are in first person, they do end up making the character a lot like themselves. They'll make their character like the same things they like, have the same problems they have, and stuff like that. If you read a lot of different series of books by the same author, and if they're all written in first person, it's super interesting because you can notice how all those characters are actually alike because the author is writing them very similar to themselves. So it's really interesting to see that. I read one big series once that was really hard to get through, and the main characters, it was funny, were girls, but the author was a man. So I noticed that the girls didn't seem very relatable to me as a girl, and I realized why, and it was because they were in first person, and the book was written by a guy, and so he was giving them his way of thinking, his likes and not likes, and men and women are different, so it ended up being a little weird because they weren't very similar to a real girl. But I'm not saying that you can't write a book about a guy if you're a girl, or about a girl if you're a guy. You can totally do that. Just make sure that you talk to people who are of that gender and figure out what they're like and try to form them like they are, because that'll make it more realistic, right? Whether or not there's magic in your stories or realistic things, you always want your characters to be realistic because your readers need to relate to your character and understand them. And so, that was a fun rabbit trail. So first person, in a first person story, you are the main character. In second person, you are not going to read a lot of second person books. The only time I read a second person book, it was really challenging to read. It was well done, but it is challenging to read. And it's very hard to do. But if you want to do that, go right ahead. You can only get good at stuff if you practice it. And so second person, it's usually written to yourself. If you read a book and it starts in second person, I'll explain more in a second, that usually means that the person is writing to their past self or their future self or something similar. So second person would be like this. You walk into the woods. The trees are quiet. Your ribs begin to hurt, so you sit down on a log. As soon as you sit down, the pain goes away, and the plants on the log begin to grow and bloom by your face. So that would be second person. Like I said, it's usually directed to yourself, or maybe, I just realized this, either directed to yourself, future self, past self, or to another person. It's very odd to find a whole book in all second person though. If you do find one, please let me know, because I would love to read it, because it's such a rare form. And one day I want to write in it. That would be fun. So that's second person. It's to self or to someone else. And very rare. Now we have third person. And there are so many forms of third person point of view, but I'm just going to go over like two main things that you need to remember in it. So third person would be, she walked into the woods. Her ribs began to hurt. So she sat down, and as soon as she sat down, the pain went away, and the plants beside her began to grow and twirl around her face. That would be third person, but you could also do third person like this. They went into the woods together. Amelia thought, I wonder what he's thinking. I wonder if his ribs hurt like mine. But her friend said nothing. She sat down on a log, and as soon as she did, the pain eased. So that is another one. One more version I'm going to explain, and they walked into the woods. Amelia's ribs were aching. She wanted to ask her friend if his were aching too, but she didn't feel like it because she felt so sick. So she sat down on a log. Abe, her friend, wanted to tell her how much his ribs hurt, but he didn't. He just couldn't get the words out. It was almost like something magical was keeping him from telling her. So he also sat down on a log. So that was a really weird example, but basically, in third person, there's a narrator, and this person is outside of the story, and they're looking in. But the narrator doesn't have a name or anything. It's more like, if you think about it, God, in a way. But the narrator doesn't say their own thoughts. I mean, you can, but that is a very complicated form, so we're not going to talk about it. So, the narrator does not say their thoughts. They're just telling the story. And they can either know the main character's thoughts only and what the main character is feeling, or they can know everyone's thoughts, or interchangeable. So they can either know all the thoughts in the story, or they can only know the main character's thoughts. Both of those are third person, and third person is telling the story with a narrator. So I'm going to go over all those three again. And we have first person, where the main character is you speaking, so telling a story about yourself. Second person is telling a story to one person, but very directed to them, or to your past or future self. Third person is a narrator, and they are telling a story to a group of people. That is the easiest way you can explain it. So, we're running out of time, and I'm going to add plot twists to next week or the week after that, and instead we're going to go straight to fables, fairy tales, folk tales, and myths. So, oh man, this is so much fun. So first we're going to explain a phrase, and that's passed on orally. If someone says a story has been passed on orally, it means that in old cultures, they used to just sit around a fire and tell stories that their grandparents had told them, and their grandparents had told them that, and it goes on and on through history. And the stories change as they get passed on. Sometimes they get more interesting. Some people will add things, exaggerate more, take out some things. So the story up here that the great-great-great-great-great-grandmother made up and told to her kids, and then they told to their kids and told to their kids up to the future day, or to around like the 17th century when people began to write these down. They're totally different because they were passed down orally, which means like speaking it out. They changed, which is really interesting. But anyways, so that's what it means to be passed down orally. And this usually happened in the olden days, but I mean in history. But it can still happen today if you make up a fun nighttime story to tell your kid that your parents told you. Maybe your parents make up stories at night to tell you. Maybe it's a funny story their parent told them, and more. So, first we're going to say what a fable is. And most of these were passed down orally. And that's why they're called fairy tales, fables, myths, folk tales, and not just story. Because they had a specific purpose, and that was to be told to younger people and passed on and told to everyone. So first we're going to talk about fables. And a fable is the main characters are animals, plants, or forces of nature like wind, moon, stars, but human-like versions of those. So a fable, if you wrote a fable, it could be about a bear, or it could be about the moon, and they would be talking because they're human-like. So you make animals, plants, and forces of nature human-like in a fable. And in fables, they're usually passed on to teach a lesson. So maybe in a fable, the main character doesn't listen to his mom and he sticks his hand in the fire, for example. The bear does that and he gets burnt. And so a grandma would be teaching that to her grandbaby to teach him not to stick his hand in the fire. So that's a fable. And now fairy tales. This is the most common one. Lots of times people will just refer to all of these as a fairy tale, and that's totally cool. Yeah, these titles get mixed up a lot, and scholars and people who study this for a long time, they'll like debate about it and debate what definitions, but it's all fun. And so fairy tale was specifically written for kids, not adults, not older people, specifically to younger people. And they would always a fairy tale has to have magical characters, and the characters have to be good and evil. So they can't be characters who are sort of good or sort of evil. Usually a fairy tale starts with once upon a time too. And now folktales are very cultural, and what I mean by that is a folktale in Kenya in Africa is going to be super different from a folktale that originated in England. And this is because with folktales, cultures have to do with them a lot. So some fairy tales, they could have come from a lot of different areas because magical characters are all over the world in stories. But folktales specifically have a very special culture, and the place where they're from is very important. Okay, and myths. Now, myths, M-Y-T-H, are super fun. So, myths are like a fake version, you could say, of how things came into being. We know that God made Earth, God made us, and he's super creative and amazing at doing that because he's very skilled, he's God. But myths were ways that people used to explain all those things when they didn't know about God. So even if you're a Christian, you can write myths because they're just for fun now. And they're just to make an interesting new way of how something came into being. So you could say the origin of the world, or why there's seasons. It could be because in Greek mythology they had a goddess who loved nature, but her daughter was taken away from her each winter. So in the wintertime she would start crying and it would get cold and everything. And then when her daughter came back over the summertime, everything would bloom again. So that was why Greek people, or maybe Roman people, well, Greek, originated that. Why Greek people, how they explained seasons was through Demeter and Persephone. So myths are like origin stories for everything, and they can be super fun. Lots of times myths are usually known to be superstitious, to be fake. Most people understand that now. And they'll be passed on just as tradition. With indigenous people and Native Americans today, they'll still pass on their stories of how things came into being, whether or not they believe it, because it's tradition, which is what grandparents do and what your grandparent did, and so you do it today to keep that and to hold on to that culture and those fun stories. Okay, so those are fables, fairy tales, folk tales, and myths. Some fun versions of folk tales that are your reading recommendations are The Pied Piper. It came from Germany. Jack and the Beanstalk came from England. Fun story, the first title of Jack and the Beanstalk was The Story of Jack Spriggins and the Enchanted Bean. And it was actually written in 1734, which was a very long time ago, like 3,000 years ago or so. And then The Goose Girl. This is a little less known of a fairy tale, and that was also written in Germany. And Goldilocks, which was written in England. Those are all folk tales, and you may have heard of most of those, or just one or two, and that's totally okay. So for your reading recommendation, it's similar to last week's reading recommendation, and it's to find your favorite fairy tales, your favorite folk tales, fables, and myths, and and find as many fun ones as you can, because there's so many interesting ways people can explain things and explain morals and magical creatures, and it's so creative. And yeah, that is everything for today. So point of view and fables, folktales, everything fun. Yeah, have fun finding folktales. They're the best.